Welcome to Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Haman, the podcast where we dive deep into the habits, mindsets, and strategies that set top financial advisors apart. Today, I'll be talking with Ken, solving the advisor's biggest challenge today, engaging with the next generation investor. I'm Scott Tatum, director of the Advisor Institute at AllianceBernstein. Today, we're going to deal with an issue that advisors desperately hope or think they've already got a handle on: engaging the children of their best clients. I am, of course, joined by Ken Haman, the managing director of the Advisor Institute at AllianceBernstein. Ken, we need to bring an issue to the forefront of our viewers' attention: the real and present danger of next generation investors taking their assets out of the advisor's practice upon inheritance. To cover this in a way that really benefits the listener, we need you to cover three things. First, we need to dimension the problem. Next, we need to look at what are the behavioral issues that get in the way of both the advisor and the client dealing with this issue. And lastly, we need to put together an intentional process to mitigate the issue. So let's put first things first. The numbers around this issue are truly daunting, aren't they?
Well, Scott, they are. And I think the interesting idea you have of starting with dimensioning the problem really isn't about whether we have the research that tells us the magnitude of the problem, the location of the problem, even the whys of the problem. But it's because the problem is so fundamentally threatening to advisors in terms of the well-being of their business. It's very difficult for the advisor to get focused on it and not have some defensiveness creep in or some rationalization creep in to keep them from really understanding the situation they're actually in. Human beings do not like to feel threatened. They do not like a future that's uncertain. They do not like the patterns of the present to change. We have a deep organizing principle inside each of us called the status quo bias. It's one of the behavioral economics heuristics that have been very well studied. We don't like it when things change. And as a result of that, it can be difficult to get our attention on this problem and to pay it appropriate focus or put appropriate focus on. Now, this is something that's been happening in the industry, well, since obviously before you and I started working in it, but clearly within the scope of the time that we've been consulting. The key issue of the day, the big challenge for the advisor of the day, has evolved in these big kind of lumbering chunks of time. We've had issues around how do we deal with distressed clients, obviously around the Great Correction. We have issues of how do we get referrals from centers of influence as clients became less responsive to direct marketing. We have issues around succession planning and growth through acquisition that have been more recently emerging. The big issue today, for reasons that have to do with demographics and the history of our industry, is what are we going to do about the next generation? The challenge of the next generation has emerged as far as my observation, and you and I have shared offline conversations about this. This is a big deal. And it's a big deal because it's observable, because it's such a large and robust situation collapsed into a very narrow period of time that's immediately in front of us, but also because it's a problem that's very challenging for advisors to focus on and to think about solving. Why is it a problem? Because advisors tend to narrow frame their business. And I cannot repeat that enough. Advisors tend to narrow frame their business. They tend to simplify their business. They tend to work with the issues immediately in front of them. They tend to work with the people they've established relationship with. And so we observe in terms of the experiences of whether the advisor is working in the family or not, 46% of spouses are actively involved in the process with the advisor. That means that more than half of spouses are not engaged with the advisor in the process. Children of advisors, a tiny percentage, and grandchildren are essentially ignored. And the times when the children, grandchildren, and spouses are involved have a lot to do with the family itself saying, we want this to happen. More importantly here is that we know from the research, and there's been more than a couple of studies done in this, that 80% or more of next generation clients, the children of your best clients, plan to switch advisors within 2 years of inheriting their wealth. 80%. That is an enormous number. And in context with that, if going forward in a period of time, we're going to look at here in a minute what that period of time looks like, we are not growing as an industry. I mean, there's pockets of growth here and there. There are advisors that have had very robust growth. But as a general rule, advisors are not growing. As advisors get older in their career track, growth tends to slow down. And other than acquiring practices, that the idea that we are growing organically is simply not present. So we have an engagement problem, we have a departure problem, we have a growth problem, and we have a demographic problem. This is a quick and dirty projection according to the information from the Census Bureau and mortality tables, where we're looking at the number of baby boomers who will die in the next 7 years. We're looking at this incredible bump of mortality coming at us. The oldest baby boomer turns 80 this year. That means that 76 million baby boomers are now in the last stage of life. The best clients of advisors' practices in many cases are individuals in their 70s and 80s who are now entering the last stage of life and are going to be inheriting their wealth downstream in various ways. The next generation is also coming of age. The oldest next gen, or the oldest generation X, turns 60 in 2025. It's really difficult for advisors to grasp that the children of their clients are now well grown. They're not just in their 20s and 30s and getting started. They're now established individuals themselves. And these are individuals who are navigating their own financial lives now. And if the advisor hasn't established or doesn't establish themselves with this group of people, it's going to be very challenging for that advisor. So as we begin this reflection on what can an advisor do to grapple with this idea of the next gen and what they want to do about it, the picture is pretty bleak. And I wanted to start here because advisors have a very powerful way of kind of emotionally avoiding the pain of this. If we know from the research, a different research study, 81% of next-gen clients say they've already decided, they haven't inherited wealth yet, but they've already decided that they're not going to work with their parents' advisors. If we look at the leadership of the firms obviously concerned about business continuity. 80% of next-gen clients of current assets departing in the next 20 years is a very daunting challenge when you're growing at 1 to at most 3% a year. The numbers don't work for companies, right? So the leadership is galvanized around this issue. I'm in conversations regularly, and you are certainly presenting regularly our thoughts on this, because this is becoming an emerging issue of focus. But leadership itself, when surveyed, says, we're not sure how to do this. This is a challenging problem. And if then we look at not just the engagement issues, but just have the next generation even met their parents' advisor, to even know who that person is, had a face-to-face conversation, 75% have not met their parents' advisor. So this makes this issue now poignant. Demographics are bringing it toward us rapidly. The statistics from every research that's done out there are saying, hey, we need to be concerned about this. These numbers aren't statistically modest findings. And so as we look at the problem, and I think we need to take a hard look at the problem, there are actually multiple challenges that advisors are facing here. One has to do with the advisor's ambivalence about reaching out. And advisors are ambivalent for not just one reason, but a whole host of reasons. Their clients, the baby boomer clients, the mature clients, are reluctant to discuss the issue of the next generation and their value system and what are we going to do about that because of the potential for conflict. And the next generation themselves has an emotional point of view that doesn't connect well with the advisor's agenda. And there are compelling reasons that they want to make their own choices about advisors. So you put these three things together at the same time with the demographics and the uncertainty, and we have a serious issue that advisors, I think, really need to take much more seriously.
All right. Well, Ken, you've succeeded in thoroughly depressing me. One thing I know I've learned from you over the decades is that when advisors are, I think the word you use is ambivalent about something that's this important, there's always a behavioral driver or drivers there. And you also mentioned that clients share that ambivalence. And that means there are behavioral drivers behind that. So let's understand where the resistance to deal with this comes from.
Well, it is a resistance, Scott, and it's a resistance born of self-defense. The advisor is defending themselves against pain. The parents of the clients are defending themselves against pain. The next generation client is defending themselves against pain. This isn't individuals that are distressed at each other. They're in pain about a situation, and we need to understand it. Now, my point in raising this up, and to your point, perhaps creating a little distress in the early stages of these comments, is not because I think all hope is lost. I think there actually is reason for hope about an advisor taking action and successfully engaging their existing clients and the next generation in a process that solidifies an engagement with both generations and with the practice. I think that's where we're headed here. But in order to craft that, the advisor has to understand this is a very particular emotional experience, and they have a big part to play in it. That is to say, if they create a process and author a process and facilitate a process, they can move the needle, meaningfully move the needle. But until they grapple with their own issues around this, it's going to be challenging. In fact, it's going to be impossible. And the reason it's going to be impossible is shown in these statistics that I touched on a little bit earlier. Let's take a look at this observation. 46% of spouses are engaged with their advisor. In other words, the husband and wife, or the wife and the husband, whoever's the lead financial architect for the family, only 46 of the spouses are equally engaged. And that means that 54%, the majority, slight majority, are not engaged. They may know the advisor, they may have had some conversations, but they're not engaged. Now, that is happening because the advisor finds that convenient. There's not an advisor who's listening to me that would say, oh yeah, it's a good idea that I don't have a great relationship with my best client spouse. But it's an artifact of the fact that there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done, things are moving, and the spouse may or may not be easy to work with, they may or may not want to be engaged. And if the advisor tolerates that or accepts that or says that's what's what, you know what's going to happen there? And we see it over and over again. When that engaged spouse passes, the disengaged spouse tends to move on. But you start to look at the children engaged. So remember, we're talking about baby boomers and Generation X. Generation X is in their 40s and 50s and early 60s. The oldest Gen X turned 60 this year. You have highly engaged individual clients who have a spouse that's not engaged. The kids are not engaged, and yet the kids are all grown and are prospective clients themselves. Of course, the advisor is looking at that and saying, well, there's a lot of work that would have to be done to capture those clients. And of course, the grandchildren, ultimately the inheritors, are seen as irrelevant completely. Why is that? It has to do with the way the advisor perceives time and the way the advisor sees significance in time. What are the things that matter to the advisor? Well, when you look at spouses, next gen, the generation beyond that, it's so far out in the future. And obviously, we've been talking about the great wealth transfer, for a decade now? But for a decade, it's been out there in front of us. If you look at the demographics, it's been a slow increase in the mortality, that long tail at the front of the mortality charts. Well, that's now coming right at us. In the next 7 years, a third of baby boomers are going to die, according to the current mortality chart. Well, that means that what has been off in the future is now in front of us. And yet for advisors, if you think about off in the future as 4, 5, 6 years, for the advisor, the stuff of their business is 4, 5, 6 weeks, 2 or 3 months out into the future, a year out in the future, maybe at most. And so it's off the screen of significance. I illustrate it this way. Every advisor has a whole bunch of immediate things they must do. It consumes their cognitive capacity. And those are interesting words. Remember I said earlier, advisors tend to narrow frame. They tend to narrow frame the number of things they do. They tend to narrow frame the number of people they work with. If I can work with the husband and not the wife, or the wife and not the husband, or not have to deal with the kids, that simplifies things down. Narrow framing is simplification. They also narrow frame in terms of scope of issue. So the immediate things that are coming at them on a daily basis from clients, and good grief, advisors are engaged in a whole host of things for their clients. That list of immediate to-dos is enormous on a daily basis. And no disrespect for that, and not diminishing the amazing significance of that. And by the way, most advisors who have great sales assistants or client associates and appreciate how much of their business that key person does. I strongly recommend, if you're not rewarding them well and you have a great one, ramp that up, because that person's making your life possible. But the things that you should do that are not immediate, that are nice to do or would add or be additive, tend to not get much energy from the advisor. There's so many other things immediately. And of course, the things that are can-dos that, that would be augmenting or expanding, fall off the screen entirely. This is every day for advisors. And if the advisor isn't aware of this and isn't aware that some of the stuff of their life needs to really be brought into the foreground, that you're giving yourself a gift by taking actions that'll pay off in 3, 4, 5, 6 years, that may take 2 or 3 or 4 years to mature. I have an advisor. It's a great example, a great case study. Advisor I met with 6 years ago. We had some very substantial conversations around generating referrals from centers of influence. And this advisor decided, he's in the Midwest in a second tier city in the sense of population. And he decided he was going to pursue a very specific group of centers of influence who had a very specific access to business owners, and spent 3 years building relationships, building a pipeline, building credibility, building referability, and now is generating, in terms of closed new business, over $200 million of incoming a year, all from a cluster of centers of influence. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen because he responded to the must-dos. He said, I can do this, and so I'm going to do this. And he balanced his must-dos with his can-dos, and the results have been spectacular. So what's another reason that advisors find this off-putting or difficult? Well, they know that trust requires experiences to build. The fact that you've met the next generation clients or the prospective clients doesn't mean that they regard you, doesn't mean they know you, and certainly doesn't mean they trust you. Every advisor at least intuits this, if not understands this. In the same way we coach advisors who are buying a practice, start connecting with the clients of the new practice the first day of the partnership, and do that intensively over that 3-year ramp up so that you have time to deliver experiences of trust. This is critically important, and yet when the advisor looks at this and says, okay, I'm going to go start engaging with the next generation client, and I'm going to start not just being introduced, but I'm going to start working with them, meeting with them, doing things with them, prospectively working to develop this trusting relationship. It takes time. It can take years. When an advisor first engages a new client, trust isn't at its highest point in the first week, in the first month. In fact, we observe it takes about 3 years for the trust of a client to reach its highest point with the advisor. And that's if the advisor's doing things for them. And that's if the advisor's solving problems and demonstrating professional expertise. This is the big challenge for the advisor working with Next Gen. There's a critical mass that has to be achieved of trust, of experience of delivering trust. And the advisor looks at this and says, well, it's going to take me so long to get there. Not just it's going to be so much effort, but it's going to take so long in order to get them to the point where they're fully engaged with me and see me as a valuable resource, that the process itself is daunting. And then there's the ultimate inhibitor, the ultimate creator of ambivalence, and that is fear. When you talk to advisors about, okay, should you go talk to the next generation? There's not an advisor that says, yes, I should be better engaged with the next generation clients in my practice. Now, some rationalize that they've done something, or, we do pretty good work with these folks when their parents are getting older and the transition of the wealth is going to come. But the problem, for the most part, across the largest number of individuals, is the advisor looks at starting the conversation with the existing client to say, hey, we've worked together well. How about I start working with the next generation client? And they're not sure how to bring it up. They're not sure how to manage the conversation. They're not sure what the destination will be. They're not even sure what they're offering at that point. Now, at the Advisor Institute, a decade ago, we created a couple of checklists, the early accumulator checklist, the premarital checklist, and the new child checklist, all as ways for advisors to go to their grown clients, their mature clients, and say, hey, you have kids in the early stages of life. This might be a time for us to start getting active with them. Those are methodologies. Those are scripts that an advisor can use, but they require the advisor to know where they're headed with that. And they require the advisor to see that client as relevant. This is the big inhibitor. If the advisor doesn't know what to do, they're going to have a sense of anxiety. And human beings don't like uncertainty, and they don't like the unknown. And so what happens is the advisor is activated in their system too. Let me make sure I can get this kind of image across. We all know about the two-brain theory of Kahneman. If we don't, it's time that we read a couple of books. Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a great introduction to this. System 2 is the deliberate, logical, analytic brain. This is a part of the brain that says, yes, I should be working with the spouses of every client. I should be working with next generation clients. I should be connecting with the grandkids in a meaningful way, not an introduction, in a meaningful way. But then time passes, things happen, we're uncertain about how to do it, we get busy with immediate stuff, and we start using system 1, which is our instinctive, natural, reactive part of the brain. And that foils our ability to think strategically. We want to simplify things. We want to make it easier. We want to narrow frame, make things manageable. We like the status quo. We don't want that to go away. And as we'll see in a couple of minutes, that status quo bias is really affecting how advisors are thinking about the future of their business, even advisors who are actively trying to grow their business. And so the advisor will simplify their situation and say, well, I brought in one of my kids and they relate to this next generation. That'll help build the bond. And that is a simplification that, again, we see that advisors are doing this. That's at least something that you're doing, but the next gen kid doesn't have the same gravitas and maturity as the advisor. And just because the kid is relating to that next generation client doesn't mean that they have credibility with that individual. But more importantly, this idea of status quo. As I've been interviewing advisors over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been doing a lot of work with advisors who are buying practices. And I started asking this question, and it's a very powerful piece of information that I want advisors to start thinking about. If you're managing your practice and you're thinking next gen now, hopefully we've stimulated that, or if you're buying practices and you're thinking about these clients that are coming to work with you and have assets that are going to pass to the next gen. I started asking advisors, when you calculated the value of this practice and you looked out over this payout over the next 5 years, remember the demographics, how many of those baby boomers are moving into that mortality table, right? So as you think about 5 years to pay this thing out, how much regretted attrition did you build into your assumptions? What were the numbers? You're a business analyst. You know how to parse the numbers. How much regretted attrition did you build in? Remember, 80% of clients are saying, next gen clients are saying, we're going to leave. Not I've inherited and I have left. We are going to leave. How much of that have you built in? 100% of the answers I received from advisors was 0. Now that's a stunning revelation of what advisors actually think their risk is. Now, this gets more complicated because remember, the advisor's a uniquely responsive, uniquely reactive human. They've been trained to respond to their clients. So the client would be raising the issue of next generation engagement. The advisor would be all over it. But if you look at the way the baby boomer client, the biggest, best clients of our current practices, are dealing with wealth, it's really interesting. There are only 4 destinations for wealth. That wealth can be paid out in terms of taxes. That wealth can be spent, something the baby boomers do, but not like next gen does. That wealth can be gifted to philanthropy. Some research I saw a couple of years ago says only about 17% of families are highly motivated to be philanthropic. Most families, when they think about the destination of their wealth, are going to spend some of it and gift the rest. It's the most common pattern that we see. But there's a problem, an emotional problem for these destinations. Obviously, taxes are not something that any family wants their wealth to go to. Most individuals, certainly higher net worth or ultra high net worth individuals, the biggest hurdle to their success in life was the taxes they had to pay on their way to developing their wealth. They are highly tax adverse. And by the way, advisors who are not cognizant of this and aren't using the best tools available are putting themselves at a disadvantage in terms of working effectively with higher net worth, ultra high net worth clients. This cadre, this generation of baby boomers, they're not spendthrifts. They are all about building, saving, taking appropriate risks. But their whole vision isn't, oh, I'm going to spend myself into this, luxury surroundings. They're concerned about that. They're often very frugal in that regard. So spending isn't really an option for them, nor is philanthropy, because philanthropy is disembodied. There's a sense of, you say, yeah, we wrote a big check to the nonprofit that we support, but there's nothing about that speaks to the meaning of their life. The meaning of their life is their family, in most cases. The meaning of their life, especially if they've accumulated real wealth, high net worth, ultra high net worth clients, meaningful wealth, their mind expands and they begin to think very meaningfully about not just their lifespan, but the impact of the wealth on the next family, the next generation, even the generation beyond that. I've shared recently that my daughter, Sarah, had my first grandchild 2.5 years ago. Now I have an experience of the future extending decades and decades and decades beyond my own lifespan with a person that matters a lot to me. So this expanded mindset about the next generation is part of the experience of wealth. Wealth causes that. Here's the problem, however. That next generation has a different relationship with wealth. Their experience of wealth is about how money creates happiness through experiences. And they grew up in a family that had wealth in many cases. And they learned the pleasures of spending that wealth. And so in many cases, you talk to advisors who have clients who are concerned about the next generation. And a lot of advisors' approaches would say, well, we'll do some investment education for these folks. That's not going to change their values. If you're going to work effectively with next generation, it can't be, well, let us teach you how your parents think about the money. They're not going to engage that. So there is an implicit challenge even there that the baby boomers are concerned about this process, that there's this sense of potential conflict. We have the wealth originator who has a set of values. Those values they want to communicate to that next generation. Oh, we're concerned about, you want to buy a house and you want to buy a nice car, you want to take nice vacations. Is that what the meaning of my life's work was? So you can live in a nice house, drive a nice car, and take a nice vacation? And yet the next generation, as has been true for thousands of years, has their own values, their own sense of how it should work. This is something that could create a conflict. And so the baby boomers aren't coming to their advisor saying, hey, let's grapple with this. Let's walk into this. If that's going to happen, the advisor's going to have to show them how it can be done so it doesn't have to be conflictual. The last piece of this to be aware of, and this kind of stitches together the challenge for the advisor, and then we'll show you, I think, an effective way of addressing it, is this idea of what's going on in the next generation. And I point this out as a psychologist. One of the things that's hard for advisors to get is the sense that these are now grown-up humans. Grown-up humans have been through a process where autonomy has been what they've been striving for decades. When an infant is born, they're highly dependent. But almost immediately, the neurology of their body begins to develop. The muscles of their body, they grow. And as they grow, they become more and more autonomous. I just spoke this morning with our program manager whose new son is 16 months old and now is a toddler running around. That's autonomy. The drive for autonomy is matched with a decrease in dependency. By the time you get into adulthood, you're highly autonomous, you don't have a lot of dependency, but more importantly, even infants have this drive for self-determination. I want that, I want this. A 4 or 5 or 6 month old is starting to grab things and put it in their mouth. I want, me. The drive to self-determination is built into the human creature. And so this is the challenge for the advisor. These are the things that are contributing to this. It means that most inherited wealth does not remain as net worth. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit or a lot. People tend to buy things. If you ask ultra high net worth clients, what's the one thing you don't want your kids to do with the wealth they inherit? They'll say, we don't want them to just go out and buy a fancy car. What's the most common thing that happens when you inherit wealth? You go out and buy a fancy car. It happens on average within 19 days of inheriting. Interesting study, another piece of information for the advisor. This one's a different study than the others I've quoted. 27% of heirs who are anticipating inheriting wealth say they plan to keep their advisor. That means 73% are planning not to before they inherit. And then ultimately what the study revealed is when they inherit the wealth, only 20% actually continue working with the parent's advisor. And that's an issue of self-determination and autonomy. 20% of kids grow up feeling uncertain not autonomous. They don't have a strong drive for self-determination. They're happy to let others run things for them. That's the 20% that's going to stay. The great ones that are going to go out and do stuff on their own are going to do their own thing. So we are in a situation where the terms are bleak. Now, in one study that was revealed was that in high net worth, ultra high net worth relationships, a higher percentage of next-gen clients stay with their parents' advisor. Why is that? Because they create multi-generational relationships. These are family offices or advisors who are dealing with a small number of families, and they see the family as their client, not just the individual investor. This is the situation the client's in. This is the situation the advisor's in. And there's an opportunity to reproduce these results, perhaps even do better than 45% of assets retained, but it's going to require doing some real work around the issues.
So, Ken, that was a really great summary of why advisors have a real feeling that they need to kick the can down the road or say, yeah, I've got this covered, when they probably know they don't have it covered. It's also, I think, really instructive to understand that the clients also have resistance about having these discussions with their children. So now we're down to solutions time. What can be done? And here's what's really, I think, intriguing about this. For advisors who can take this from a can do to a should do to a must do, if they understand how to tackle this, this is not just playing defense. There is a real opportunity for this to become something that is truly accretive to the practice, isn't it?
It's absolutely accretive. And in fact, it can be revolutionary. And we're going to key off of this idea that in traditional financial services engagement, using traditional methodologies of investing, not adding some dimensions that we can now creatively add, that are what's going to be the thesis of what I'm going to propose here. You see a retention of assets because the advisor's mindset is that my client is the family. My client is the process the family is going to go through, and I'm going to engage each generation at their point of need. And I'm going to do it with a high degree of skill, and I'm going to demonstrate expertise. And I'm going to demonstrate not just to the parents who engaged me, but to the kids, the grandchildren, and the children after that, that I am a important, perhaps even irreplaceable resource for the family to remain engaged with. This doesn't happen accidentally, and it doesn't happen by showing up 6 months before the client dies and introducing yourself to the kids, or worse yet, to introduce yourself to the kids at the funeral and say, hey, I'm always here for you if you need me to be there. It's about intentionality. So we're going to explore a 6-step process. Some of the steps have to do with mindset and shifting perspective, but a lot of it's going to have to do with bringing some new perspectives and new resources into the process, changing your approach. It should be clear at this point that if you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always gotten. And the statistics are saying that what you're going to get is a whole lot of next generation clients leaving. But we can use insights from the financial services industry that are emerging at the cutting edge. We can use insights from the behavioral sciences. And we can address this creatively and say, look, there's a lot that an advisor can do if they choose to do it. But it's going to have to do with establishing a mindset, redefining your sense of urgency, and creating a methodology of outreach. You're going to have a script and the confidence of knowing where you're headed and what you're proposing to them. It's going to mean meeting these generations, understanding they have different points of need with a process that both can relate to. And then introducing that process so that they actually come together and create a shared understanding of the wealth. Now, that has been the missing link forever in the financial services industry. That is to say, how do you have the existing client, the baby boomer, author, originator of the wealth, and the next generation share the same vision, the same values, the same perspective about next generation engagements? So while the baby boomer client, like myself, a mid-stage baby boomer who has a grandson, is now looking at the grandson and then the future generations beyond that and saying, okay, how can I be meaningfully engaged, meaningfully supportive? How can the success that I've had translate? How can the story of my life connect to my grandson, Rowan, to children that Rowan may have, children beyond that? That process can be shared and can be brought to the next generation, my kids, with the same mindset and same set of values. It's not about education, it's about an experience. So let's take a closer look at where I'm going here. The first thing is for the advisor to say, what's my job to be done? The typical advisor, as we saw earlier, is looking out into the future and is deciding what is important, what is the scope into the future that I'm working. Working with the next generation, the generation beyond that, is something that's going to span years or decades. And if the advisor's sense of time has collapsed into the immediate, that, my job is this job right now, engaging this way, and the parents, the originators of the wealth, have expanded their sense of the future of time, and the children, the next generation, need to expand their sense of time. If the advisor is still working in the immediate, this is going to be a problem. And so it really has, the starting point for this is for the advisor to say, what is my sense of scope? What is my sense of the timeline I'm working in? And how do I move from a collapsed sense of time to an expanded sense of time? Now, as an advisor, if you're listening to me and say, what do you mean a collapsed sense of time? Well, if you understand that your job to be done for your clients is to build portfolios, is to figure out what the advantage is of certain sleeves of investing in the moment to create the best risk-adjusted return in the next period of time. You're a portfolio-centered advisor. Your time sense has collapsed. And if that's what you're offering your existing clients as they expand their time sense, you run the risk of that originating generation, your best clients, saying, you know what, my concerns aren't about this anymore. So this is very true of the ultra-high net worth client. A significant portion of ultra-high net worth clients, when they achieve that elevated state of wealth, start being concerned about things that aren't about the immediate growth of the money. And if the advisor sustains that as their mindset, you're at risk of being irrelevant to everyone. So it's important to be able to move beyond the immediate, and that means expanding your sense of time. The client-centered advisor thinks about the scope of the client's life. This is a planning-based approach. It looks at goals in the future. And that client-centered advisor can do good work for the uniquely successful baby boomer client, the originator of the wealth, because that, as the originator expands their sense of, we need to think about the future, we need to think about wealth transfer, we need to think about generations to come, the advisor can go with them because they're focused on what the client is concerned about. But we think the real future of the industry and the future for advisors who want to retain assets is to become a visionary advisor. And that's to realize that the family is your client, that the family process is the focus of your scope, that helping a family across multiple generations shepherd this wealth forward becomes the work of the advisor's job to be done, that the advisor's ability to mature their perspective on the client's needs and understand that the client isn't just the first person who engaged you, but it's the entire scope of the family, and to realize that the family doesn't know everything they need to know to navigate this issue of wealth successfully. That's the first job for the advisor to shift from the portfolio is my focus to the family is my focus. Now, that means we have to shift our sense of urgency. The sense of urgency isn't the immediate things that are being asked of me in the practice. You certainly have to fulfill on them, but when we start working with a family as the focus, then the must-dos, the should-dos, and the can-dos expand outward. And we see things at a distance as compelling for our attention as much as things in the immediate. So there's this sense of, what am I paying attention to? Who is my client? What's my job to be done for my client? And what's my sense of time? Now, with that in place, and with a few resources in place we're going to talk about in a minute, now you're in a position to see your client differently and to understand that they are going to need you to initiate a conversation with them about the next generation. Remember that conflict potential. The baby boomer doesn't have the skills in place to talk with their grown kids about their values. Now, if the kids are very dependent and the originators of the wealth, the primary client is very dominating, they may be able to do that. But in most families, there's some reluctance to tackle this. And there's a sense of, well, we'll get to it. You know how human beings are. If the advisor has a sense of confidence and engagement, knows what they're going to offer, knows how to approach the client, then the advisor can begin to bring this expanded sense of the job to be done to the client, meet the client at their point of need before the client may even have words on it, but knows that the client's anxious about this. When Rowan was born, all of a sudden, my sense of the future exploded. And now what I need to be thinking about and doing expands beyond any knowledge I've had in the past. This is true for all these families that have unique levels of wealth. So the client, the advisor, understanding where this client is at, understanding that their brain is expanded, their sense of the future is expanded, their sense of anxiety about the future is expanded, can approach them. And here's a really simple script that any advisor who has a process in place can bring to a client. It's a simple sentence that could be introduced at an annual review. It could even be done on the phone. Pick a triggering event. Say you're the oldest child of your best client just turned 45. Or you're at the annual review and say, hey, we're at this stage in life where things are getting complicated across your family. In your ideal world, how would you like me to relate to your children? Now, our suggestion would be to do this earlier rather than later. When you see the children of clients getting into their late 20s, early 30s, and every advisor right now is like, oh my goodness, you're expanding my workload dramatically. And I would say, yes, I am. It's going to require you to work with fewer clients with a lot larger pools of wealth, because those 20 and 30 somethings aren't going to be great clients in terms of revenue. But if your client is the family, getting engaged in that early stage, saying, in your ideal world, how would you like me to relate to your children? And now start a conversation with the client. Now, this is going to require you to come to grips with a fact of reality. In some cases, the individual is going to say, yeah, I'm not comfortable with that. You're just going to work with me. The kids are on their own, or I'll deal with that separately. They're just going to hold you away. It can be too threatening, or they may have preferences. And asking the question doesn't threaten the relationship. It's a gracious and warm opening, but it may be met with, I'm not comfortable with that. And if that's the case, then you're going to have to accept there will be future attrition in your practice. It is very unlikely that this person's children are going to stay with you. Now, why would that be an important thing to arrive at? The best thing you could do for your practice right now is go to every single client, ask that question, and find out what's the likelihood of the future trajectory of my business. Now you have a reality test. Now you know what you're facing. Now you can do something about it. In those cases where you ask the question and the individual's like, wow, that's a great question, their response is going to be, well, I'm not sure. They've not thought about it. If they had thought about this, they would have said, hey, would you have this relationship with my kids? And in some cases, they're saying, hey, do you think you can sit down with the kids and do some education with them? Education isn't going to solve the problem. You can't educate someone about something complicated if they're resisting you and saying, yeah, that's not consistent with my value system. You're asking me to do and become something I don't want to do or become. So you're going to have to address that. Your process has to be more than education. But if you have a process, then you can propose an approach at this point. Say, well, there's an approach that we can do. Let me explain, let me describe what it would look like and what the ultimate results will be, what the ultimate goal would be of our process. And now you can expect this individual to lean in and say, wow, that addresses my deepest concern at this point. That's a way that I can get engaged and ensure that not only my wealth, but my life story and all my wisdom might be able to pass on down to my relationship with Rowan. So what does this actually look like in practice? Well, what you have to do is meet both of these generations at their point of need. The baby boomer is aware of this long-distance concern. They have this perspective about the future and the meaning of their life. They're coming toward the end of their life. They're making meanings. The next generation is very much in middle life, and they're very much concerned about experiences and values and the quality of their life. These are folks coming at life from two different perspectives, and everyone on this call can recall, especially if you're older, you can recall when you were obsessed with a nicer car, a nicer house, a nicer vacation. So now we see that there's two different perspectives here. How do we bring them together? Well, it's a step-by-step process, because the ultimate goal of this is for both generations to share a similar vision. How do you get there? Well, it starts like this. The oldest generation, the baby boomers, have to look at their journey through the perspective of, what does that journey mean to them? Where have they been from? What does this money mean? How did this money accrue? What is my life story about? And that comes down to a set of values. Those values, once they're made conscious and once they're in a position where you can talk about them, you can now create a vision. The story of my life isn't over. The story of my life continues into the future. What do I want that story to continue and look like? That vision now can become solidified and shared between both spouses. This is a process that both spouses can be involved in. My story your story, our story, my values, your values, our vision of what this money means and what we want the future to look like. And that can then be broken up into a series of letters. We call these legacy letters that can be sent to the next generation. We were thinking about this. We were reviewing this. This story means this to us. Our sense of our values get communicated this way. Begin revealing your values, begin revealing your vision, begin saying, these are the things we hope for. These are the things that matter to us. What a great gift to give to the next generation. This is what we learned. This is how we learned it. A series of letters that go out there, just loving letters of communication, not imposing, not insisting, just communication. But that can lead to the next generation after a series of these letters, after some time has passed, maybe after some informal conversations, to an invitation. We're doing this process ourselves. We'd like to invite you into this process of looking at your personal journey, looking at the meaning of your life and your values, looking at a vision that you might have for the future, and just opening up that conversation. What are your values? What's your vision? What do you think about downstream generationally? Now allows this next generation to begin sending letters upstream and downstream and starting to communicate to each other. What's the ultimate goal? To create a framework in which the generations, 2 generations, perhaps even 3 generations, can come together to do family meetings and talk about their shared values. But ultimately, through these meetings, and everyone has heard about the role of family meetings with high net worth and ultra high net worth families, this is what the role is of the family meeting. It's to share values in a safe space, to learn from each other, and ultimately to start forging a shared vision. Done properly, done wisely, and done well, family meetings begin to cross-pollinate with the next generation. Not investment education, not education about budgeting, but a sense of the vision of what this wealth could mean. And maybe for the first time in their life, that generation begins expanding their sense of the future. It happens naturally in these conversations. It's really difficult for an individual to cling to this idea of the most important thing for me in the future is a bigger house and a nicer car when I'm in these conversations with the larger scope of my family about what is the future of our family. And so the issue of stewardship introduced by the mature generation moving down to the next generation as a shared value. This is what the Rothschilds did. They created a shared vision and a shared meaning, and they invited the next generation, each generation, into that. So the family meetings become the governance of the family, the process of the family, the place where the advisor can be deeply involved with the family to facilitate that. And so what happens in the threefold process is the advisor is helping create this cohesive and resilient family. They're exercising the muscles of conflict resolution, of shared values, of shared visioning. They're exercising the muscles. I'm sharing my vision, my meanings. I'm giving that to you. You're sharing with me. It becomes a place where we can make decisions together because we've exercised those muscles. But ultimately, it can become the container for the stewardship of the family wealth. And as Jay Hughes says, the family's wealth is not its money primarily, it's the family's well-being. It's their values. It's their ability to work with each other. It's its cohesiveness. It's the ability to bring individuals in. It's the ability to allow individuals to pass on, but to maintain and sustain the family. The advisor's client becomes the family. This is powerful because what happens in this context naturally is that the next generation begins to lose its short-term perspective and begins to share with the older generation the longer-term piece, begins to own it with them, begins to see stewardship as the meaning of this wealth. So the work of the advisor is to move into this space and to give them the ability to put this together. And ultimately, as the shared vision emerges from this family dynamic, the advisor's there to help them execute, put it into place. And now the advisor becomes a participant in the stewardship, not just with the originating family that created the wealth, but with the next generation, the generation beyond that. And this is exactly how family offices operate in the relationship with these uniquely successful clients. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that if you're going to scale this across your practice, you're going to need to develop a process. And that process is going to have to be something that you can manage across multiple relationships. You have 10 or 15 or 20 people whose wealth really should be stewarded, and you should be part of stewarding that and working with the next generation. Well, one way you could do that is to decide this is going to be the core of your competency. There's plenty of resources out there. You can become a family legacy specialist. You can see that as your cornerstone value proposition. And all that's going to require is an investment in skills, staffing, being able to provide for the immediate short-term needs, as well as liberating you to do this. And there are lots of advisory practices out there. A lot of family office practices have experts in place. More commonly, you can outsource it. You can hire an external expert that can do this for you. And that, of course, can be expensive. You pass that expense on to the family. There's only so many families that can do that, but it means you're disenfranchised. You're kept at a distance from the process. Or you can decide to do this by using a resource that is run by the family that allows you to participate in it in a meaningful way, to facilitate, to hold them accountable, to keep them in it, but allows them to run the process and learn the skills themselves. So you become a facilitator, and if you use the right resource, you can become a facilitator of unlimited engagements. It can be something that your top 10 families do. It can be something that 50 families do. We have one advisor using a resource that we work with that has over 100 family units involved in the legacy process in their life. And that resource is Total Family. Total Family is a digital resource that's available to an advisor on subscription. It allows you to work with as many families as you want through exactly the process I just described. So you don't have to become the expert yourself. You don't have to outsource it and become disenfranchised from it. You can become central to the process by using a resource that's designed specifically for clients to operate themselves, to increasingly take on ownership of the family process, but to involve you as the technical expert that needs to be there. So Total Family, collaborating with AB, we're in an ongoing educational partnership. It's a great resource for advisors. I would encourage you to visit totalfamily.io and explore what they're offering and see if this resource might be something you want to work with yourself. This is a resource that we feel strongly enough about that we've partnered with them to lend them insights from the Advisor Institute to enrich the work that they're doing with client families. Scott, at this point, what we have there is a vision that advisors can begin to embrace. And what I'd like to suggest is this is a great opportunity for advisors to think, what do I want my practice to look like over the next 10 years?
Well, Ken, thank you so much. I mean, this started off as a true downer. Those numbers are so daunting, but the reason I'm so encouraged about this topic is those behavioral barriers are so real that most teams are simply going to choose not to deal with this. For the teams that do embrace the family as their client and take the steps that you outline, their practices are going to become so much more satisfying and so much more lucrative. It's going to be a true game changer. And that's a wrap on this edition of Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Haman, the podcast where we explore the science of clients, setting instincts aside so that insights can guide.